Nichols and Prince designed a series of studies to empirically test how their moral continuity accounts stood up to those other supposedly superior accounts, including the account of identity as formed from our memories. They came up with a study in which participants in two conditions read vignettes that allowed them to compare perceived change to identity when memory versus moral values were affected. Here's the memory condition vignette. Imagine that John accidentally falls while walking in the mountains. This accident causes a head injury that has a profound effect on John's memory. Because of the injury, John can no longer remember anything about his life before the accident. He is, however, able to form new memories, and his personality and values remain the same as before the accident. For example, before the accident, he used to do helpful things for people in his community, and he continues to do this with enthusiasm after the accident, though he doesn't remember that he used to do it before. So in that last vignette, John had an accident that led to all of his memories being wiped out. They compared that to another vignette that involved a change to John's behavior that affected him morally but not cognitively, preserving his memory after he fell. Imagine that John accidentally falls while walking in the mountains. The accident causes a head injury that has a profound effect on John's values. His memory and general intelligence remain the same as before the accident, but the injury causes John to stop behaving morally. For example, before the accident, he used to do helpful things for people in his community. And after the accident, he stops caring about any of that and only acts to fulfill his own happiness, even at the expense of others. For both of these vignettes, the participants were asked to rate the extent to which John is the same person before the accident. Completely the same person, 6, or not at all the same person, 1, were the two anchors on the Likert scale. The results indicated that the change in values affected ratings of John as the same person significantly more than the amnesia. One might say, hold up though, the change in values meant John became a bad person, but in the memory case, John did not become bad. Maybe there's something about the direction of the values change, becoming bad versus good, that affects perception of identity change. The researchers then tested the difference between a change in values that was in the direction of bad versus good. So a third condition was introduced. And in this vignette, the change of values goes in the other direction. Here, we imagine that John accidentally falls while walking in the mountains. It causes a head injury that has a profound effect on John's values. Again, his memory and general intelligence remain the same as before the accident, but the injury causes John to transform morally. And this time, for example, before the accident, he used to be very selfish, working to fulfill his happiness even at the expense of others. After the accident, he suddenly stops acting selfishly and instead does helpful things for people in his community. So now when we look at these results, we want to compare the change in values, bad values and good values. So in the first case, remember, there was a significant difference in how much people thought that John changed. He was not the same person. When the investigators compared the amnesia condition and the bad values condition. But they wondered maybe it's just about turning bad, the direction of the value change. Here's the resulting mean for good values, 2.59, next to the mean for bad values, 2.56, and amnesia for comparison, 4.32. A change in values toward good had the same effect on perceptions of identity as a change toward becoming bad. John was equally not the same person, and again, significantly more changed than a person who got amnesia. So it was not just a negative values change that accounted for the effects on perceptions of identity. Value change generally was perceived as affecting identity. significantly more than a person's memory capacity. But do we think about identity as hinging on moral values just when we think about other people? Or do we see ourselves as having a unique identity because of our particular moral value? In a subsequent study, they modified the vignettes slightly to ensure that the results held when the vignettes were made self-relevant. They asked different participants to imagine you went hiking and fell, and then rate the extent to which you are the same person before the accident. They found that, in fact, the means were similar to the third-person versions. It appears that we assess ourselves by our moral values just as much as we assess others that way. And again, there was no difference between the bad values and good values manipulation. So whether values change to you becoming a worse person or a better person. And in both cases, values changed perceptions of the self more than thinking about themselves losing their memories. But what if you choose to start doing bad or start doing good? Does this affect how we think about the role of values in personal identity? The next study aimed to get at this by testing the role of agency in perceptions of identity, keeping constant this moral change. We began all this by listing some ways that philosophers had conceptualized personal identity. One really popular view is that I am who I am when I'm deciding what I do intentionally. This vignette tests whether the agency account better accounts for perception of identity than values change. I'll read this vignette. Imagine that John accidentally falls while walking in the mountains. He's not injured in the accident in any way. His memory and general intelligence remain unchanged. But the accident causes John to rethink his life. John decides that life is too short to waste time worrying about acting morally. For example, before the accident, he used to do helpful things for people in his community. And after the accident, he stops caring about any of that and only acts to fulfill his own happiness, even at the expense of others. If agency matters to our perceptions of the sense of self, then the resulting mean should be different from the mean for bad values with no agency. Changes that we choose should keep our identities intact. That's the idea behind the agency theory of personal identity. But the moral changes John chose in this last case were perceived as changing him just as much as the cases in which he undergoes a change in values without choosing it. The bad values cases we started with. Agency does not seem to be the linchpin to personal identity intuitions. And again, this goes for intuitions for the self, too. So when the experiment was run with the vignettes referring to you, and the participant rated changes about the extent to which you are the same person, agency did not make a difference over and above moral change in the bad values original condition, when the person had just fallen and ends up acting worse. But what about narrative continuity, also posited by philosophers to be key to personal identity? It seems intuitive that my meaningful story is what makes me me. To test this account, the vignette was altered. Here, I'll read it. Imagine that John accidentally falls while walking in the mountains. The accident causes a head injury that has a profound effect on John's ability to construct coherent stories. Before the injury, John often thought about his life in terms of an ongoing story. After the injury, he can no longer tell stories or follow stories, and he stopped thinking about his life in terms of an ongoing story. But his personality and values remain the same as before the accident. For example, Before the accident, he used to do helpful things for people in the community. And he continues to do this with enthusiasm after the accident, though he doesn't think about how this fits into his life as part of an ongoing story. So, how did the change in the ability to make narratives stack up against the change in values in terms of people's perceptions of identity change for John? Compared to bad values, it did not change their belief that he'd be the same person. The mean is similar to the mean that we saw for memory alteration, and significantly different than the mean for the change to bad values. At this point, we can take a pause and you can test yourself. Here's a question. Experimental philosophers have investigated the role of intuitions about agency, memories, narrative, and moral values in how people perceive identity. Which of the following is consistent with their findings? 1. I'm more likely to see myself as still me if I commit a serious moral transgression than if I completely change my professional goals. 2. I'm more likely to believe my friend is a different person if they are found out to be a serial killer than if they develop dementia and lose all memory of me. 3. I'm more likely to view the decisions my mother made on her own in her lifetime as who she is, as opposed to her care for her family. 4. I am more likely to believe my partner is a different person if they suddenly begin recounting their life story in a new way, as opposed to if they suddenly begin treating their friends and family terribly. The answer is 2. I'm more likely to believe my friend is a different person if they are found out to be a serial killer than if they developed dementia and lost all memory of me.